Okay, hi everybody. Still on topic 7, hearing and noise. Subtopic 4, we're going to talk about specifics of auditory displays. Now, the topic of displays, topic 4, it covers in pretty great depth about display concepts and principles. For the most part, they focus on visual representations, though. And so this is basically saying, well, here's a few extra things to think about in the world of I could convey information to a human via the auditory channel, instead of exclusively visual. All right. So first of all, I did want to, make a call back to topic 4 and recognize that a display is anything that conveys information to a human that might be used towards, some task. But it can be conveyed via any of the senses. And so even like, when you're walking through the mall and there's good cookie. Do we walk through the mall anymore? But when you used to walk through the mall and you can smell the cookies from the cookie store, and they're just kind of wafting that out there and they're trying to draw you in, that's an olfactory display, effectively. All right, so why would we want to consider then an auditory display for what we're trying to convey? Some of the benefits here, just like hearing itself, compared to vision, auditory displays don't rely on a direction of our sense organs. So from all directions, we will receive a message. That's good if, for example, there's a fire in my house and the let's see, the smoke detector, the fire detector flashes a really bright light. I'm not going to see it, right? Even if it was in the same room as me, I may not see it unless my eyes are oriented, towards that thing. So an auditory display doesn't depend on people's eyes being pointed at it or their ears being pointed at it. You're going to receive it if it's loud enough and there's no, hearing disability for, in a person. All right, so we can't close our ears like we can close our eyes. So this is also a way to ensure that a message gets through to somebody. They can't easily ignore that channel. Partially because of this, auditory cues are really great for capturing attention, for directing attention. So when you really need to get somebody's attention, they're doing something else, and nope, this is the important thing right now. Auditory cues are great for that. That's why alarms, smoke alarms also are, that's one of the benefits of using that really loud, obnoxious auditory channel cue. Because it'll attract your attention no matter what. Remember the difference between visual stimuli and auditory stimuli is that auditory stimuli by nature exist over time. They are about the oscillations, in the pressure waves, not about any one state in time. So it's a little more persistent for the visual sorts of representations. They're a little better for things that I may need to keep coming back to. But for things that, the displays that are really appropriate, they have a temporal component to them, or they're temporarily relevant and then not, right? For transient information, it has existence in some part of time and then it goes away, just like auditory signals. And then finally, and we'll talk about this more so in topic 8 on how to distribute workload and why how we would look at multitasking and workload in certain contexts. For the most part, our visual resources are in high demand. Imagine something like driving a car. And so in that sort of environment, we want to convey more information to the human. We've got more data that might help them, better in their driving task, but we want to not necessarily introduce that visually because basically, I've got all this other stuff I need my eyes for. So you could use a different channel like an auditory display to convey information without, further loading or putting further demand on the visual resources. Now, if you are conveying something auditorily, one of the questions from a human factor standpoint is, Do we rely on the descriptive power of language, to be able to communicate a message from a device or another person to a person? Get it into my head, get that message in there. Do we use language, or do we look for more iconic representations, that maybe don't take as long, but also maybe not be as clear, in their message? So some of the things to think about here, in general, time is the biggest factor. So if I have the time to elaborate, having a verbal voice-based display is probably preferable. So if there is an urgency to what you're getting, and if detail is important, right? And then otherwise, iconic tones. And a buzzword here, which you can see in the textbook a few times, is this idea of earcon. So if I have an icon, I guess they said, all right, well, what's the auditory version of that? Okay. So yeah, earcon is the term. And this is basically, a auditory pattern that you recognize, it has a deeper meaning than it has. So we're all imagining right now what this sounds like, and that is an iconic auditory signal. You know what the meaning is behind that alarm sound. I'm not sure if this is going to go through, but I'll give you one more. Here it comes. I don't know if that went through or not, but I just disconnected and reconnected my USB. I got the classic Windows, you just disconnected something just was connected sound. It's iconic, right? It's an iconic sound. It works because it conveys in a very short amount of time, and only a very simple auditory cue. It conveys a lot of information, right? All right, so now if I've got something that needs to be continuous, and I'll show you an example coming up soon of what we call sonification. So certain types of auditory displays that are giving continuous information. It's a lot harder to keep track of language over, like complex language over a continuous term. So you might use a more coded version, bells, buzzers, etc. All those, these. And now the key thing here, and this is another place where human factors gets to come and play, is to find naturally mapping associations between the message that's being conveyed and the way you encode that in an iconic message. So here's an example. So you have to make sure they map well. You also have to make sure they're informative, right? And they're not just a sound, hey, there's a problem, figure it out. So here's an example of something. I just found this earlier today because I was trying to, there's a human factors paper I was trying to find, and it's related to this, and I just couldn't find it. So instead, I just went and found more information about the actual problem itself. So this is a Boeing 707. I'm not sure how often these are produced today, but one of the known problems on this is or at least is the similarity among different alert sounds in the cockpit. And so I was actually able to find you can go to YouTube and find the actual voice recordings that are used for a lot of the alerts in some of these commercial aircraft. So I'm just going to show you here. This is what a loss of cabin pressure warning sounds like. Get ready. Okay, so I'm flying my aircraft. I get that going off. That's certainly captured my attention. Certainly seems to communicate an urgency, which is appropriate, because if the cabin pressure is not maintained, I'm gonna maybe die, or maybe my passengers are in trouble. Okay, so there's this one again, and then one more time. Okay, now keeping that in mind, I'm going to show you what the landing configuration warning sounds like. So now this is, I'm coming in for a landing, or wait a minute. I'm actually not sure what this means, but it's basically when your landing gear are down and you might not know that they're down, or vice versa. Oh, that's what it is. You're coming in for a landing, you don't have your landing gear down. That's what it is. Okay, so let me show you what that sounds like. All right, now close your eyes, and I'm going to push one of these, and you tell me which one it is. Are you having a landing gear configuration error, which is a big deal? or are you having a cabin pressure loss error, which is a big deal? Okay, get ready, close your eyes. All right, which one was it? Joke's on you because it's the same sound. I used exactly the same sound, but that's because it is literally the exact same sound that they use for those two alarms. And this has been a known human factors thing. They'll point to it and say, well, this is confusable and it's not a helpful thing if humans hear, oh, there's a problem, but they have an ambiguous idea about what that problem is. There needs to be a clearer way to convey, here's the nature of the problem, so that humans are ready to act and ready to address that. And they're not stuck trying to figure out, okay, well, what's going on then? I know there's a problem, but where is it, right? Okay, so this was the human factors paper I was trying to find. If anybody knows any more about this and can help me find it, would love that. But looking at some more naturally mapping ear cons, and so just some suggestions here, and I think these had been tested in like a, in like a laboratory setting. But when we think about a loss of pressure, it naturally maps very well to. I'm opening up a snap. I chose Snapple because that to me is the one that has that. You know what I mean? Yeah. I can hear that one very clearly in my mental representation of a Snapple. But okay, so that's maybe a much more naturally mapping sort of association with that problem. And similarly, they looked at, well, let's make the sound of landing gear, the sound that we associate with landing gear more than anything else. Let's make that the alarm that goes with, you've got a problem with your landing gear. And fire, believe it or not, this is always a problem to look out for on aircraft. And so they're always, if you go into YouTube and say, aircraft warnings and alerts, every aircraft has one for fire. And, one of the things that had been suggested I saw in the past is, well, make it sound like a fire bell, like, people would associate with, being in a firehouse. And then I want to show you, this is what the Boeing 757 sounds like. So I think to some extent they're finding solutions here. They are looking into that natural mapping that's associated with the sound and its meaning, and doing a little better to take advantage of it. Okay. All right, I mentioned this idea of a continuous auditory display. So not just, there's nothing going on until there's a problem and then there's an alarm. That is an alarm is an auditory display, but it's not a continuous auditory display like I'm about to talk about here. So sonification, it basically means taking a somewhat continuous stream of data and audibleizing it, finding a way to map it to a continuous auditory signal. So a really good example is a Geiger counter. So for like radioactive activity, right? So what you're hearing is click, 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 click. I think that's actually something like radioactive particles like actuating something. It's actual radioactive particles striking something that initiates that click sound. And what's nice about it is you can be continuously listening and you can hear click, 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 click. You're getting auditorily the information that is, okay, I just took a wrong turn, around the corner and now I'm exposed to, a lot more radiation or whatever. So it's yes, there's a visual representation here too, but it's an auditory display, and maybe the auditory channel is probably the most relied upon for this sort of a task, because I'm looking around and I don't have really that much, time or ability to also look at my little visual meter. And so I can separate those sensory inputs, and I can work with both of them. All right. If you've ever used a, auditory based metal detector, you're essentially sonifying the electrical field patterns, or not the magnetic field patterns, around the base there. I think it probably works like an inductive coil thing. So you're essentially hearing what the electronics of this system are sensing in the changes of, the magnetic field there. Also, oops, hello. Sorry, it got away from me. This one is my personal favorite. You'll hear me talk about this whenever I get into my displays research. What I like about this one so much is it's a continuous display of what's going on with a patient, in a critical care setting, although you can have these, outside of a hospital too. And each beep that you hear is a heartbeat. And so if there's an irregular heartbeat, you're going to hear it in the cadence of that beat. And you're also going to be able to tell if the person is getting the oxygen that they need, because the tone, the pitch of the tone is conveying how much oxygen is in the blood, the saturation of oxygen in the blood. So let me just play what that sounds like. So it sounds familiar if you've, watched any operating room, theater sort of sitcom or whatever. All right, you get it. So maybe you didn't know that before, but the beep, 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 obviously that's the heartbeat. But if oxygenation of the blood would start to go down, you'd hear beep, 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 beep. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that a lot of people hear around COVID patients, because oxygenation has been, one of the major, one of the major results of COVID. And so variable tone pulse oximeters are important, more important than ever these days. And so maybe they're a little more familiar than that, but I really like them because it's in a critical care setting. You can hear one, if either of these two things goes wrong, the oxygenation drops or the heart rate, gets irregular, it immediately captures attention of everybody in the space. And otherwise it can kind of just exist in the background. You can kind of ignore it for the most part. So it's a very effective display in that you don't miss when there's a problem, but it's not in your face and obnoxious if there's not a problem. All right. I also wanted to point out, I did some research, don't hold it against me. I did some research with police officers years ago, which involved the multitasking that they need to do while they are basically, operating in their vehicle. And one of the interesting things I learned about was these radar guns, which, you can operate like this, but typically if they're mounted in a vehicle, you need your hands to drive the car, so it's mounted on the dash. You also shouldn't probably be looking at this visual display while you're driving your police car if you're a safe officer of the law. And so that sort of is, well, what's going on there? Well, there's actually a lot of these will sonify the speed of incoming motorists. So the police officer doesn't need to be looking here. He or she can hear, there'll be this sonification that has a distinctly higher pitch when there's a vehicle that's approaching at a higher speed, right? So it sonifies that pitch, and they can hear when there's something particularly, fast coming in. All right. So as we're, thinking about designing for, the auditory channel, auditory displays, the characteristic range to work with 250 to 2000 hertz, that is well lower than the highest limit, of frequencies we can hear. And part of that is because, again, as we age, we're losing that top end. And, it's not uncommon for 10,000 to kind of be about the top of what, people, as we age, what we may be able to hear. Right. So you want to go on this, lower end. This is also because, lower frequency sounds will travel further, as we talked about in the previous lecture. They will be less affected by barriers and things in between the sound source and your ear. So those lower ones will travel farther when there's, a need to alert somebody further away. One of the things I always like to point out is the difference between, so the strengths of each of the high frequency and the low frequency parts of the spectrum. In fact, I don't have my thing on right now, but because I will probably see something like this on a midterm. If I were to ask, what are good properties of a cell phone ringtone? I would like to see something along the lines of, well, we want to be able to hear it. If you could reason through it, I need to be able to hear it across the house or on the other side of of my apartment or whatever. So I need the sound to travel further distance. Well, then I'd say you want lower parts of the audible spectrum to be part of your ringtone. And then I'd also say, well, what if I'm in a room and I can't find my phone? I know it's around here somewhere and it's ringing. Well, now remember that extra benefit that you get for spatial localization with higher frequency tones. Remember the cricket and the interaural level difference. So then I would say, well, if I want to find my cell phone in a room like this, or maybe a room full of things where cell phones could hide in, and I need to localize it, then I want higher pitch tones in my ringtone. So what I always say is, I look for, when I get a new phone, I look for the ringtone that goes like, like goes from the low end to the high end, because then I know I've got some of that frequency, that frequency range that I want for each of those properties of a ringtone. So anyway, there you go. Thanks for paying attention. Look for that on the midterm. Maybe. All right. So anyway, considerations, the frequency range matters. The level, you want at least 5 decibels of A, the decibels of A weighting. At least, better to be 10. And then the military standard, which, you might say is pretty good to use as your minimum, I guess, says 20 decibels of A above the background ambient noise level. So if we get our phone out and we turn on the sound meter app and I shut up, and it'll probably tell me something like it's about 35 decibels, in here. So I'd want to say, well, I need at least 55 decibels to have a meaningful auditory display in this context. Okay, now alarms are a special type of auditory display. And so they have their own criteria, and these are going to come, to some extent from the military standard, but also just kind of human factor stuff in general. So in the previous one with displays, the previous slide, 20 decibels is what military standard says, to be able to be heard. An alarm is something, do not miss it. Everybody in this space needs to get it. So we're going to ramp it up that much more. And so it needs to be 30 decibels, probably 30 decibels of A weighting, I guess, to be technical, above the noise level to guarantee, right? All right. There it is. So for auditory, I just said that, military displays. Yeah, auditory displays, but then alarms, again, being, higher than that. And sorry, my animation was a little goofy there. Do ensure audibility. Again, our older population is especially going to have problems with the high end of the spectrum. And in fact, all of us are slowly losing our high end of the spectrum. So, if I could generate a sound right now, and you could say, I hear it or you don't, if I knew when how old each of you were, I could probably map out the highest pitch each of us can hear by our age. And so we'll talk more about that in subtopic 7.5. All right, so 90 decibels I mentioned is where the hearing police come in and say you need to change things about your work system so that workers are not exposed to noise levels this high. 90 is that limit. Again, we'll talk about that in the next subtopic 7.5. But it's nice to have that also in the alarm criteria here. So to recognize that if you can stay below 90 decibels, but still meet this criteria, then please do so. Otherwise, it says, well, if you got to still be above the ambient noise level, at least this much. Oh, yes, do not startle people with an alarm. And actually, my PhD research involved anesthesia displays for anesthesiologists. And I was looking at vibratory patterns. So like if you could put on a vest that had vibrating elements, in the back, and it would vibrate in various patterns related to blood pressure and respiratory patterns on the patient. And so, I was looking at all these, I was looking at the sense of touch and tactile displays, and this was my application environment. And I would talk to a lot of anesthesiologists who said, don't startle me when I'm holding when I'm holding needles full of drugs that could kill everybody in the room, right? Yeah, and I said, okay, yes, that's a good point. So we do have to think about what's the context in which you are maybe interrupting somebody, and if you use a startling auditory sound, I was talking about vibration, but the same thing works here. If you have a loud, startling auditory cue, you don't want people to, have any disruption of the tasks that they're working on. All right. Yes, and so yes, that's exactly what I was saying here. Consider the context. Is there going to be a good amount of other people talking? So do you want to use a speech-based, display or alarm, or maybe is it better to, use something more of a tone? Yeah, and so you got to consider the auditory context into which the alarms will be traveling through the same medium as all that other auditory noise. And finally, make sure that the alarms help the human solve a problem. Don't just scream, there's a problem, there's a problem. Give some information that helps the human figure out what it is and figure out how to address it. All right, thanks everyone. That's 7.4.